So I'm here with Joe McNally. We're at PIX 2015. Joe McNally, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
You're one of the most experienced photographers who's here presenting at the show. I mean, how did you get started in photojournalism originally?
I was literally forced or required to take a photography class in journalism school. I went to the Newhouse School at Syracuse, and I was thinking I was going to be a writer, but a part of that curriculum was photographic, and I think I knew immediately when I took a camera in my hands that was the direction I was going to go.
Right. So what do you think makes photography, I mean, what made you think that? What made you go, actually, this is what I want to do?
You know, a combination of things, the feel of a camera in my hands. I still love the sound of a shutter, you know, the idea that you could actually click that shutter and hang on to a slice of time forever. You know, it sounds very mundane, or platitudes get often wrapped around that phenomena, but it's an amazing thing that still photography does. It stops time, it stops the world, it makes you look, it makes you feel, and there is nothing else that I know that's like it.
So when did you first realize, when did it become a career, I suppose? I mean, was it pretty much immediate?
Well, I got determined real quick. I mean, the career was always in doubt, and probably still is, you know, to some degree, depending on my next job. But the notion of going to New York and trying to make it as a photographer became very, very firmly rooted in my head very quickly. And I soaked up as much information as I could. I stayed in school for 2 more years. I did a master's in photojournalism, and I went to London. And I went as a lab tech for an overseas photo program that Syracuse sponsored. And I got a chance to do some wonderful things over there. Went out in a fishing trawler out of Lowestoft on the east coast.
I know Lowestoft.
Yep. And in November, the North Sea is not an easy body of water in November. So I was sick as a dog and all those things, but I also was just hanging on to the railings as we were plunging through waves, and I thought, this is it. This is what I have to do.
So in between retching, you thought, this is where I meant to be.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I feel awful. This is really the way I want to feel the rest of my life.
So what was the first job? What was the first, I guess, in your mind, like the big job, the first big assignment?
Good question. Things are incremental, I think, as opposed to now where, if you hit a big picture and it goes viral on the internet, you're all of a sudden on the landscape. Yeah. A career back in the days of film at that point, a little more incremental. I was introduced to color shooting for ABC television. I got this weird job as a staff photographer for ABC Network. But there was a series of things that happened after I quit that job. I specifically quit it because Discover magazine assigned me to shoot the first launch and landing of the space shuttle.
Right.
And they were a new magazine on the block at the time. I was looking at 3 weeks of day rates. I walked into my boss and I quit. And I took those 3 weeks of day rates and I went to Northern Ireland. I didn't have an assignment, but Bobby Sands was about to die in the H blocks as a hunger striker. And everyone knew that the north of Ireland was going to become very fractious, more so violent. It was where it was going to go. So I went there and I ended up with an assignment from Newsweek and from Bunte magazine in Germany. I also established a relationship with Peter Jennings, who had moved up as the ABC anchor. My old boss at ABC said, well, try to photograph Jennings. Long story short, I ended up going to London to photograph Peter, and literally minutes after I walked in to the ABC London studios, the Pope had been shot. And Jennings looked at me and said, you want to come to Rome? And I said, yeah. And so he put me on a private jet. I was a kid. I had no money. He checked me into the Cavalieri Hilton Hotel on the ABC credit card. So all of a sudden, I had a burnt up credit card and I think about $60 in my pocket. But I stayed on assignment for Newsweek in Rome for about 3 weeks. And when I came back, all of a sudden I had a freelance career rolling.
I mean, there's a lot of people in the photojournalism industry are bemoaning the quote death of the art. I mean, do you think that kind of career path could happen now?
This is going to sound foolish maybe, but it can happen, but it will be very different. Yeah. I mean, that idea of the tenets are still the same. You have to shoot well. You have to tell a good story. You have to be sensitive to the world and what's going on. You have to identify areas of potential interest or explosion, or shift, or culture, or all those things. So you have to spin all that stuff in your head the same way as any journalist has ever had to do that from time immemorial. Your path will probably be different. It'll be internet fueled. It will be probably multimedia involving the moving picture as well as the still picture. You'll have to perhaps establish a consortium of people who might monetize you instead of a magazine saying, okay, here's a contract for 6 months. Those are rare things.
Yeah.
But I think the path is still available. It's just perhaps a bit more convoluted and complex to negotiate.
And presumably you have to be ready, you identify all those hotspots, you identify all those opportunities, and if you're ready to drop everything and go there.
True. Easier to do when you're obviously younger and not attached, and mortgage and children and all those things. Certainly when I disappeared to Northern Ireland, all of a sudden I extended, it was no big deal. I didn't even have a pet. I didn't even have a goldfish, And those were looser times. When I first went to Africa for the National Geographic, I sensed that slice of the story was bigger than my editor had perhaps imagined. I was slated to stay for, a week or so in Tanzania. I stayed for 3 weeks. When I came home, I called him. I said, I just came back. I came down to the magazine. He didn't bat an eye. I was like, yeah, okay, good. So thought it was bigger? Yeah, it was worth it? Yeah, okay, good, fine. No issues, no somebody pounding on your head saying, how could you have spent that money? Good God almighty.
I couldn't get you on your phone, you weren't replying to text.
But it was also in the days before email, sat phones, FaceTime, cell phones, anything. So when you were gone, you were gone.
Let's talk a little bit about technology, actually, and just go back a little bit. I mean, what was the first? You've seen enormous changes technologically during the course of your career. Mm-hmm. What was your gear when you first started out? What were you shooting at?
I've always been a Nikon shooter. My first Nikon camera was a Nikkormat in 1973. And at that point in time, you were pretty much, if you were going to be a pro, you pretty much shot Nikon. And I graduated from there. I started using F2. I mean, that really dates me, but I've really been through the mill of cameras. So now I'm shooting, D4S. Who knew,
So what was the first exposure you had to digital imaging?
To digital imaging? I was actually just starting to dabble. The D1X, the Nikon D1X, was the first camera I saw coming down the pike that could rival Kodachrome. And I borrowed one, and I shot at Churchill Downs in the Kentucky Derby. And I thought, well, this is not easy, but I said, really, it's different, but it's not. There's a picture in there someplace. The same way it was with a film canister, it's just a little different. Now it's electronic. So that transition, the camera felt the same, exposed the same, all that sort of stuff. Certain things you had to maybe alter in your head to look out for, but other than that, the physical transition, if you will, from film to digital for me was pretty easy. Right. So much so that within 6 months of actually starting to shoot that D1X, I was given the first all-digital story at the National Geographic. And I shot that. It was a story on aviation. I shot that all on D1X. And that actually, they considered it such a sea change in coverage at the Geographic, and kind of a notch in the belt of aviation coverage, that it was incorporated into the Library of Congress.
Right, as a sort of a point in time almost.
A little bit of a watershed, kind of a, and Geographic was obviously very attentive to the story. They were concerned and interested all at once, and very rapidly thereafter, the magazine pretty much went almost entirely digital. Because everybody, it's just facilitated coverages.
So what were I know a lot of photographers, especially photographers for titles like National Geographic. I spoke to someone a few years ago from Nat Geo who said he in his mind he was getting one good picture a year. He was proud of that. That was the cadence he was working at.
Yeah.
How did your workflow change when you went digital? Were you still thinking, processing and handing off images in the same way, or did you find yourself doing a different workflow?
Not necessarily a different workflow. You had to be very careful exposing Kodachrome, and I just took those tenets of the technical aspects right into digital, and I would look at a digital frame, because at that time I was fine with the camera. I knew nothing about Photoshop or anything like that. And in fact, for geographic, what you do as a digital photographer in the field is you dump all your raw files onto a hard drive and transition them back to the magazine without touching them. So it's really, in lots of ways, the same way as sending your Kodachrome to Kodak, and then it ends up on your editor's desk.
So you don't do a lot of post-processing yourself?
No, I don't. I don't know how, first off. I'm not very proficient at that aspect of it. I'm not here to say that we don't do Photoshop. We do. All digital images need some measure of adjusting in the aftermath. I'm luckily blessed with two really talented young assistants in our studio, and they'll handle the digital duties when we need them. But we're not the studio that you come to for, replacing buildings or skies or stuff like that. Right, sure. We do basic darkroom work, is the way I would describe it.
Right. I've asked them similar questions. The world is full of images now. So many more pictures are taken now than they ever were before, and they can be disseminated instantaneously around the world. Do you think photojournalism is better now as a consequence, or has it just added to the noise?
Well, can I say yes and no?
Of course you can.
Certainly there is more noise out there. And there's a lot of photography. A lot of it's bad. A lot of it's good, or a measure of it is good. There's people on Flickr who are like, man, they don't do it for a living, but they can knock your socks off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the journalism thing there's an immediacy to it, given the democratization of the entire medium, that has to be treated with caution. I had a woman at a workshop who came to me and said she was on staff at the EPA, and she said that she would, basically because she was the person in the unit who had the camera, she had been given the job of documenting this massive study that they were about to do. And this was hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a study on impact on lakes and this and that. And she said, could you give me any tips? And I looked at her and I said, yeah, you need to be trained as a journalist. And that wasn't the tip she was looking for. I think she was looking like, always use a tripod, or something like that. I'm like, too many people think I pick up a camera, I'm a journalist, or I'm a documentarian, or I am an art photographer, or whatever it may be. And so the technology being so facile has kind of enabled some folks maybe to skate around the idea that this is hard to do. Yeah. You need to be trained. You need to know how to identify a story, how to identify a source, how to vet things, how to be responsible in the way you produce and show things, the emotional and informational linkages between photographs, the fact that you have to move a reader from point A to point B to point C. My editor at the National Geographic always told me that the small pictures have to be paid attention to, because he always identified them. He said they're the interconnective tissue that holds together the larger bones of a story, which is actually a really good analogy. A story is a living, breathing thing, and you have to piece it together carefully. So, yeah, there's some slapdash stuff, but there's also some powerful, very immediate stuff. You got to take the good with the bad.
And how important, I speak to a lot of portrait photographers who often tell me the most important thing that they do, or the hardest thing that they do, is not the craft, because they learn that and then they have it down. The hard thing is actually making a connection with the person that walks into the room.
Absolutely.
I mean, is that true in your experience?
Absolutely. The emotional connection between you and the subject means everything in a portrait situation. And I think there are photographers who forget that a little bit, especially maybe some of the photographers who might be on the beginning of their curve, and they're so worried about their stuff and the f-stops and shutter speed aspect of it that they forget there's a human being out there in this very vulnerable place in front of a camera. It's a vulnerable, emotionally difficult place to be when you get in front of a camera. Not to say that some folks, like Hollywood folks, they have it knocked, they're fine about it, but when you're relating to people, generally speaking, you've got to treat them really, really well. Emotionally, that's a difficult thing for them to do. So I always feel you have to be at risk yourself emotionally. You have to care so much about doing a good job for them, with them, that you're both kind of out there on the wire.
So I realize this is probably quite a difficult question to answer, but if you were approaching a situation with a stranger on an assignment, how would you go about breaking down those barriers?
Well, you mean in a street situation, or
no, for say a commission? So we talked earlier on about a politician that you photograph, someone that you may not instinctively align yourself with or even like that much. How do you connect with someone like that?
First and foremost, before you meet them, there's some information someplace about everybody.
Yeah.
I do my research. I try to. Even if it's the grandmother of the year, why, how many grandchildren does she have, where did she go to school? Do they go to the school in the same place? Have they always been in the same community? Whatever it is, large or small information about people who are very newsworthy and people who are just plain folks. You need to find something out about them, because then that helps a lot in breaking down natural barriers. Conversation becomes easier. People start to relax a little bit. Oh, okay, this guy's done his homework, how are the kids? You have 2 kids, right? Oh, and what are they, about high school age? Just that kind of, easiness of conversation can really bring someone into a sphere of comfort that will help you as a photographer.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about photojournalism. We're running out of time, we're just to sort of end. It is it seems an increasingly hard way to make a living. And how do you see photojournalism as a profession evolving in the next, say, five years?
It is hard to make a living as a photographer. It's always been hard to make a living as a photographer. It's, I think I used the term convoluted earlier, probably more so now than it's ever been. Monetization is a hard thing to get people to wrap themselves around. There's so much free photography out there. But at the same time, at this point, and my career, which is advanced, I'm having more fun with a camera than I've ever had. I have a blog that's read by nearly 1 million readers a year, somewhere's in there. That's kind of cool. It's like having a little newspaper column. I don't have to wait for magazines to call me anymore. I can facilitate an assignment, if you will, publish it on my blog, and it's published. It's out there. That is very freeing. I also think that self-assigning, identifying projects you want to do, is very, very important. Photographers can't be reactive anymore. They have to be proactive in seeking their own destiny and how to finance that destiny. And I know that, when you say finance, that's always an anathema to, oh my God, I just want to create. You can't create if you can't eat. They go hand in hand. And I tell students when I teach, I tell them, always remember there's food for the table and food for the soul. And you have to have both in equal measure or some measure if you're going to make a go of this as a photographer.
So someone, a photojournalist now who's worried about getting laid off or whatever else, what advice would you give them to keep on actually making a living out of this?
Anticipate, that you will be laid off. Those things, the telltale signs are usually there. Start to, build the infrastructure that you need to sustain yourself. Staff photographers have sometimes a tough go of it, when they've been inside for so many years that, the ideas of maintaining and buying their own equipment, infrastructure you need, computers, workstations, terabytes of storage, all that kind of stuff comes as, well, certainly there's a sticker shock associated with it because the infrastructure can be expensive as a photographer. I've been running a photo business for many years and it's a hungry little beast. It needs to be fed all the time. So I stay on the road a great deal. So I would say to ramp up social media presence. Right. Get your pictures out on Instagram. Identify what your rights are for the photographs that you've already created. Some places will allow you to pull that material and use it as the backbone of an archive or a portfolio to leverage your visibility in your next phase. Those kinds of things. Make sure you get an accountant. You probably do already, but when you run into a freelance business world, it's very different from getting a salary.
Sure.
There's certain considerations that you might not be aware of. And get a blog going. Have a voice. If only 10 people read it this month, maybe 20 or 30 will read it next month, and it builds. And then just start hitting getting work out and hitting, the phone wires and
Pounding the streets.
letting people know that you are around, you are available.
So I have one final question. If you could go back in time to the beginning of your career and give the young Joe McNally one piece of advice, knowing what you know now, what would that be?
Oh Lord, yes, I have thought about this question actually. What would I tell myself 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, or even longer ago? You do a lot of foolish things as a photographer because you are passionate and you're eager. I wouldn't temper that. I wouldn't temper that at all. I think the foolish things you do as a photographer form you, but I would probably counsel myself to be a little bit more wise about, or I would tell my young self what was coming.
Right.
And that would be a whole range of things. Personal life that you have to mix in with your photography. Physicality. When you're 25 years old, you don't think that camera bag or that gear is going to hurt that badly when you hoist it at the age of 60. Knees, ankles, eyes. I always remember Gino Capek was a wonderful hockey photographer at the New York Daily News, and I was a boy at the Daily News as an apprentice, and I used to process the film and stuff like that, and he came back in a wonderful hockey picture, and I was all excited. I was like, Gino, how'd you get that? Were you focusing them up the eyes? Because that was the holy grail of sports photography back then, was manual focus. And he just looked at me and said, no, Joe, my eyes aren't very good anymore. So I was pre-focused at that spot on the ice, and I hoped something would happen. And I was like, oh, wow, And that old phrase, experience is the comb God gives you when you no longer have any hair. So those kinds of things happen. They are going to happen. So I would be a little cautionary about that, or maybe be a little wise in accepting those gifts of aging.
Well, Joe, it's been a lot of fun talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joe
Appreciate
McNally,
it.
thanks for joining us, and thank you very much for watching.